Hey, hey.
Hey, hear me okay?
Yep. Your dulcet tones are coming through great.
How are
This
you
will be
doing
the
today?
baritone debate. I'm doing pretty good, man. How about you?
Good.
Now I want to listen.
So, I don't really have a formal case for today's argument. Busy dickering with Bronson over on Facebook. So, today's topic is
Somehow we all find ourselves doing that. I don't know. I'm hoping
yeah,
that I think we're gonna debate after this one. So
he's wonderfully pugnacious sometimes. So, so my topic today is war is evil.
hmm?
By evil, I'm using a relatively broad definition, both from a kind of common moral perspective and from the idea of sort of a biblical evil as in destruction, wrath, and mayhem, etc., sort of negative values that we would generally view, but the moral perspective of things that we think are wrong. So I guess it's a pretty simple moral claim in the sake, and I'm usually a subjective moralist, so this is my view and opinion.
Okay.
I think that war represents kind of the worst of humanity. There's nothing we do that is worse than waging war upon one another. It costs human lives. It leads to conditions like slavery, rape, theft, vandalism, destruction of civilizations, the ruination of cultures, and of course the loss of a great many lives and a whole lot of wasted effort that we could be doing something else with. So these are the things that are bad about war. Which isn't to say that sometimes people have to engage in war. It doesn't make everyone who engages in war evil. What I mean to say is that war itself is an evil, and those things that lead to it are generally evils. If you create war, that's a serious problem. When war is, a reaction to defending oneself, it's the action that forced people to defend themselves that is the evil that created the war. Not the actions of those who try to defend their lives. That's sort of a natural process. But in creating that situation, someone is creating the greatest evil that human beings are really capable of. And the act of carrying out a war involves a lot of evil actions, even if you're forced to do them for self-defense or self-determination. That doesn't make them not evil. It just changes the intent that you're engaging in. That makes sense.
Sure. I have a couple of questions I want to clarify, make sure I understand your idea of evil. Would you go so far to say that a natural disaster, say an earthquake, a tidal wave, a tornado, would you call those evil? They do bring about destruction, they ravage, they can bring about the end of societies and communities and cultures. They can do very similar damage to war. Would you classify those as an evil?
Yeah, I guess I would under the definition that I'm using. Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me that I don't think that we can classify either a natural disaster or a war as being evil. I understand, I don't want to make the argument. I think my easiest approach to this would be that war, are not moral agents, so they can't do evil. So war is, like you said, the act of what other people do. So war is not evil. You could make the argument that individuals engaging in war, at least some are evil. But one question of clarification, do you think there is even theoretically possible a non-evil war?
Non-evil war? No, generally not. I think some of the people who are acting in war may be acting in what they think is a morally just cause, right? And I may even agree in some cases. Defeating Hitler is a morally just cause.
Sure.
Just defending your life and your civilization against attack is a morally just cause.
Now,
but that doesn't necessarily change the fact that the war itself is an evil, terrible event and that it has human agency involved in it.
All right. Now, you listed some things. I was trying to write them down. I'm going to get them on. But you said war brings about, rape, poverty, the end of cultures. Do you remember, did you have them listed or were you just reading?
No, I was just rattling off the top of my head. This is the only to debate a topic with no notes.
Okay.
So,
all right. I don't know if
that's great.
I don't know
because my case is really simple. It's just sort of a personal
Sure.
viewpoint that I'm to.
Would you also accept that each of those things that you mentioned exist outside of war?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to say that war represents the worst of humanity, it's not that war brings about the worst of humanity in any special case. It is just that these things exist already, and that they may exist in certain types of wars in a greater number. Because it would seem to me that if something already exists, you can't blame the war for having created it or brought it about if that's something that would exist already. And if you were,
I guess.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to use that to build into a counter argument. Is that if you had, say, a dictator that was bringing mistreating their population, allowing their soldiers to rape, keeping their subjects in poverty, trying to eliminate the particular cultures. We have examples going on of that happening currently. There's also historical examples of entire cultures being attempted to ward out. So that is already happening. Then to say that war in those cases to bring about an end to that is an evil. So I don't want to say that you're fighting an evil with an evil, but if you're bringing about the end of, say, the end of the eradication of the Jewish culture, or the most recent one, the Muslim group that's being driven out of their country, if you were to bring about a war in order to stop that, and so then it left it in a better place, left the population in a better place, you would then still call that war evil, even though what you had said war brings about was already happening to a particular culture or a particular population. Am I making myself, did that make sense?
Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
I think that it's, again, this is a situation where it's justified.
Mm-hmm.
So the war is probably a justified act. You don't have a lot of other choice in order to stop the problems that are going on. Let's say this dictator is intractable in some fashion.
Sure.
Yet I wouldn't take away and say that, well, the war itself, the way it was propagated and what happens in war isn't evil. And I would say that the war was caused by a greater evil, or let's say a more persistent evil, because the war may actually kill a lot more people than Mr. Dictator does in the short term, but in the long run, you're going to have a better situation. Hopefully, at least that's what you're fighting for, right? Is the end to those tyrannies. So you take a short term greater pain for a long term better outcome. So Civil War is another good example, right?
Do you believe
ended up eradicating slavery? Maybe that's not what our initial intent was, but that's what happened. So the outcome of the Civil War is that some good was done, and maybe in the long term, a greater good than the evil that was done. But in the execution of the Civil War, an incredible amount of evil was unleashed, right, and perpetrated. I don't think that changes it. It's kind of like chemotherapy, right? Chemotherapy is poisoning your body with radiation, right? It's not a good thing for you. However, if you have a cancer inside of you, the chemotherapy may be your best shot at surviving, because it will do more evil to the cancer than it does to the parts of you want to keep. So you undergo that evil for a greater cause, as it were. But that doesn't make chemotherapy healthy, right? It's not. It's poison.
Okay. Well, I would say it's not poison, it's medicine. And I would say that there's a distinction between those two. I think maybe the distinction would be the same distinction that we'd call between what evil and what we would say war is. So do you believe in the distinction between combatants and non-combatants? That
in war?
In war.
As a moral precept?
That
to a degree, yeah.
So that
I think anytime you engage in war, you have to admit that there will be civilian casualties and harm.
Sure, but
inevitable.
When you're engaging in a war, do you believe that there are targets that it's okay to attack, and then targets that are not being attacked, that should not be attacked? And that seems pretty straightforward.
I think there are degrees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so assuming that there are individuals that we wouldn't want to attack, in a war that it would be unjustified, it would be evil to attack, say, certain non-combatants. Now, if those individuals are already being attacked by their own soldiers, and so then we engage in a war where we are engaging those individuals that were attacking the civilians or attacking the non-combatants. So if we engage in a dictator whose army has been allowed to run rampant and rape its population. If you're in, so now you're engaging those people who engaged in these acts about against the non-combatants or the civilians. So it seems to me that you're reducing an overall negative. That was fewer non-combatants are being attacked, right? So then the only people that are then going to be engaged in conflict are going to be the combatants. Would you? Well, my point is, in there, it seems like you're losing the idea that war causes or brings about these great evils. Where I'm trying to provide an example where war actually brings an end to these evils that already exist. So if war is evil because it causes X, X, and X, then war must be a good if it stops those same things.
I don't think so. I don't see it that way.
Okay.
It's just a perspective of, in this sense, evil is, let's see, what am I trying to do? So definitionally speaking, like, again, there's a reason that I give it kind of two definitions at the same time.
Okay.
One is a moral choice of right and wrong, which we all understand, what a right thing and a wrong thing is, right?
Okay.
Now, in a society, we have some laws about building codes, right?
Okay.
So is it immoral to follow or not follow a building code in and of itself? Maybe, maybe not, right? You might not be doing anybody any harm if the rule is silly or superfluous or something, right? So you may be putting up it or putting it down. However, you could say that, by being a member of society, an agreed member in the social contract, and you're violating the rules for any reason, that might be right or wrong, right? So there's a lot of sort of values that you can place to try and determine right or wrong.
Okay.
But then there's this idea of evil, which goes a little bit beyond that, good and evil. I mean, if you look at like fairy tales or fantasy stories or ideas, there are creatures of pure evil, right? We can have evil monsters. We can have evil this, that, the other thing. If they're not a member of society, right? If they're not bound by our laws, how are we judging them good or evil? If they're not part of our social group, right? Our good or evil are really determined, in this case, by the idea that they represent a threat to us, that they are destructive and dangerous and otherwise hostile and violent, right? These are the things that we would judge an evil monster for, because it doesn't have a social conscience, right? It's not part of a social contract. So right or wrong are a little hard to apply to, the Zoltars from the planet Mars and their black orbs of doom, or whatever happens to be. Until I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So, so evil goes a little bit beyond just sort of moral judgment, and it kind of enters into the realm of a mixed realm of both a matter of moral judgment and a matter of just sort of what is constructive, builds up, creates, what is destructive, destroys and tears down, right? And war covers both of these things simultaneously, right? So in some instances, we can say that it was right to engage in a war, right? So we have to defend our own lives from an attack by another person, right? I think that's the most primal and easily justified example. The secondary one is, yes, we are trying to help an oppressed people who are being oppressed by a minority of group. Let's just say it's bandits, attacking a town or something. And so we're going to go in the woods and kill the bandits, right?
Okay.
Slaughter them to a man. We're doing evil in the process of killing the band. I mean, we're going to go out there, we're going to rip their bodies apart, we're going to shoot arrows through them, whatever it is we're going to do. It's a violent, destructive act, right? Maybe we could come up with a nice, peaceful way to, Star Trek stun gun them and put them in a soft pillow and then send them to Doc Savage's camp where they can be re-educated to good, productive citizens or something. So maybe we could really minimize that evil. We're going to change their free will or something, right? But whatever you're doing, you're using force upon other people, and it's generally going to be destructive and painful. You're doing it in a good cause and a right cause, which is to protect a bunch of other people. Right? But nonetheless, in the act of protecting them, you have to realize that you are using force and violence, and you're doing harm to other people. That it's going to have all kinds of different consequences. So, in that sense, even when you're trying to do something just, war is evil. It's a great, terrible wrath of destruction. And while it may be the lesser of two evils in a situation, it's still an evil in a primal sense. And a pretty, war is that writ large, right? So a war, bandit is just a small example, but war is a large. Basically, you throw everything your society has at trying to crush another.
All right. So
close to it.
It seems to me that you're coming from a position where intention has no impact on whether an action is good or evil. And so if you're saying saying that intention isn't the defining factor if something is good and evil, then it seems like you would have to be a consequentialist, meaning that the result of something is what defines it as good or evil. If we've already agreed in that if intention is not what defines it as good or evil, then the result must be. Would you agree or disagree with that?
To a degree. So if we're going to talk about intent, I think you could have a good or an evil intent at an action. And so a good intent could have an evil outcome, and an evil intent could have a good outcome. That's the last one.
How do you get? It seems to me that, not to keep harping on the definition, it seems to me when you say that an action is an evil or a good action can have an evil outcome. So when you're saying evil outcome, then you mean negative or net negative. So when you're
destructive,
destructive. So is all destruction, in your viewpoint, it seems like all destruction, no matter how it happens or why it happens or what good or bad it brings about, is evil. So
if the destruction is impacting people's lives, in a destructive way. So like if I dig a tunnel through a mountain, that's destructive, right? But I'm not going to call that an evil act, because really we did it. We wanted to build a road. Nobody got hurt digging the tunnel. It wasn't, it's there for a useful purpose. From a human perspective, it's not evil, right? However, if let's say there are some people in a building that have a plague, and I blow up the building and burn it to the ground because I want to protect others from the plague, I'm still doing evil to the people in the building.
Okay, and to use your similar example, would you say that miners mining a mine would not be evil, right? That would that's destruction there, but it's not evil.
Yeah, generally speaking. I mean, if they know that somehow by digging this mine they're like killing people or destroying the earth or something, then I suppose you might be able to say
but that's an interesting point. If they don't know that they're doing it, and it ends up happening that they're doing it, would you still call their actions evil? The digging of the mine.
Interesting. I would not call them evil. And again, like I wouldn't call all the soldiers in a war evil people, right? However, they might be engaged in an evil activity, yeah.
Okay. Now, going back to the mine example, say the miners keep dying for some reason or another. The mine itself is unsafe, but the company keeps sending them in, and more people are dying. You would say that the company itself is making an evil act by sending their more and more miners in to dying, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So then if an individual comes along and blows up the mine, rendering it inoperable, and there can no longer send more people into the mine, so would you say that the act of blowing up the mine then is an evil act?
Maybe in a very minor way.
So
some evil is done in the sense that, like, I suppose you're damaging the economy and you're hurting that company, but because the company is engaged in evil, it's justified, right?
Okay.
So I would call the saboteurs good people using a violent means or an evil means in order to achieve a good end.
Well, that's interesting, because I was going to make the metaphor of you can have a regime or some city being that constantly is negatively impacting their population. If you destroy that regime, then you're going to say that they are good people using evil to to bring about good.
Yeah, basically, that's right. And I would further specify that it was the evil actions of the person that prompted the good people to react. That's the root cause, right? That's the root of the evil here, right? So I, as the evil dictator, am doing terrible things to my people. I'm doing evil, right? Others look and I would like to stop the evil. And they're like, the only way I can see to stop the evil is by enacting violence against this organization, right? So they then go and have to do that. I hold the dictator morally culpable as a person for the damage done necessary to remove them from power. So they're responsible for the war, even though other people engaged in it in order to get rid of this evil, right? But because it was a justified action, the leaders of that country are morally culpable for the war that takes place. And it's an evil war, and it's on them, right? The people who engaged in it because it needed to be done for an ultimate good, I don't judge them as being bad people for engaging in an act of war. But the war itself, the event, is still an evil. It stems from, its evil is not just intrinsic in itself, it is intrinsic in the actions that caused it to come about.
Okay. I guess I'm just going to just push back and say that I don't see how you can link an action as being evil. I mean, every action itself is not evil. So I can concede that there are evil people. I can concede that those evil people want to do actions, but the actions themselves are not evil. Yes, they may be destructive, but if you're defining evil as anything that is destructive, it seems to me then you're forcing the position where saying that inanimate objects can be evil, or inanimate objects can bring about evil, which seems to me pushing it too far. So go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, and I understand that, right? And it's one of the reasons I thought this would be an interesting debate topic, because you would be exploring that viewpoint, which I hold some strange viewpoints sometimes, or seemingly strange. But again, I kind of liken it back to this whole idea we have, in our history, in our lore and in our storytelling, going way back, the idea of evil things, an evil tree, an evil spirit, an evil sword. It's a cursed ring. It's it's an evil building. It's haunted, right? We say that because terrible things happen there, or has a spirit of evil about it, destruction, of pain, of suffering, right? And so I'm partly tapping into this. I'm saying it's not quite as irrational as people might think at first blush, and that's because there's a meaning and there's an experience there that we have that that we have rationalized away maybe a little too much. So when I say an earthquake is an evil thing, for all purposes, if someone had initiated that earthquake, that person is terribly evil for what they've done. But we wouldn't say that the earthquake itself is an evil thing. That's because we are conflating what we consider to be evil as an outcome with what we consider to be immoral as an action. And I think there is a boundary line there that we can look at and say that while these things are pretty closely entwined, there is a little bit of a ground on the side of what is evil that goes beyond people's moral actions. And there is some ground on a moral action that transcends the nature of the thing that they've done, such that it can be justified morally, even though it is something that if we didn't justify it, we would consider it a terrible crime.
Okay. Can we explore that a little bit more? The ground that you think exists between having the ability to act as a moral agent and not having the ability to act as a moral agent, and then something that our actions or the actions are brought about. For instance, just off the top of my head, the idea of a guillotine. Like, it seems to me that in your position, a well-used guillotine would be evil in itself, where to me that seems irrational, that if I were to take the guillotine, take it apart piece by piece, I wouldn't be able to extract an evil quality out of it. Evil is not something that exists apart from our observations of actions. So there is nothing evil that you can add to a guillotine to make it evil. If it doesn't do anything, if the guillotine had only ever sliced tomatoes or had only ever sliced watermelons, that would it be different than its identical twin that actually had decapitated 1,000 people? What would make those two things different? To me, those objects are exactly the same. The guillotine itself is not evil. If you want to say that the executioner who used the guillotine is evil, you could make that argument. If you want to say that the king who brought about the executions or declared that individuals should die are evil, I'm almost willing to grant you under circumstances, yes, those individuals to do it, but you can't. It seems odd to me to say that if the executioner were to use an axe instead, that evil will somehow be transferred from the guillotine to the axe, like it's an actual real thing that exists outside of an individual using it, or outside of the individual making the action. We wouldn't call a boulder that rolls down a hill and smashes into, an orphanage and kills 100 children. We wouldn't call that boulder evil. We would, of course, call well, I'm just saying I would not. If it happened because of, the rain or something, it would just be a terrible tragedy. It's not an evil. If you have somebody that pushes it or puts it there and intentionally rolls it down, the rolling it down, the pushing it, the instigating it, that is the evil act. But the pieces involved aren't evil. It's the decision to use them that is evil. So you can make evil decisions, but an action like to war is so broad that, I wouldn't say that any action like that could be evil. It's the decisions behind them that are evil. And I think you can draw a hard line between war and then those individuals that declare it and function it. That's why we can say that soldiers themselves, who are just following orders, two combatants fighting in the field, each one is fighting, trying to kill the other, but neither one is evil and neither one is committing an evil against the other one. They are defending their each.
I think they are. They're trying to put bullets through each other's bodies and kill each other. That's pretty evil. Well, in the classic sense.
I don't.
Take away the reason they're fighting, and just them fighting. That's evil.
But the thing is, if you take away the reason they're fighting, they wouldn't be fighting. The reason is important. The war. The reason is important,
but that's a moral question, right? And like I said, I'm trying to expand the idea of evil. I was in a debate on religious topics the other day, and I pointed out that God does evil in the Bible, and my opponent was like, "No, of course he doesn't." And I'm like, "Well, he does. Actually, the Hebrew word for evil is used, right? And God says, I will do evil upon X, Y, and Z people, right, for the things that they have done, the disrespect that they've shown me." And it says, it uses the word evil, the same evil that is used in other contexts is about those are evil people.
And they argued that in that context, it wouldn't mean evil, it meant destruction.
It meant wrath and destruction, exactly.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is the word evil meant wrath and destruction. That's really its root. And moral and immoral, like sin, is about disobedience to authority. And so I think there's always been this understanding in the modern age. We've moved away from it a little bit, and I think we lose a little bit of a precision of being able to describe something when we conflate right or wrong with good or evil directly. When we ignore the idea that good and evil can be more objective terms that are about building and construction or destruction and chaos. So I think we lose our ability to describe things. So if I did a diorama and I put the guillotine that you were talking about, and I had never killed anybody, I wrote a little story about how this guillotine was made because the craftsmen, love to build guillotines for whatever reason, and we covered it with flowers and gave it a nice little scented candles, and otherwise made it really pretty, right? And then next to it, we had another guillotine. This is the guillotine that was used in the French Revolution. 27 people lost their heads, and then we splash it with blood, and we make the blade kind of rusty, head in a basket next to it, right? Then we bring some people in, and we say, all right, I would like you to describe which of these things are true. Like The guillotine on the left with flowers is evil. The guillotine on the right is evil. Neither are evil. I bet a fairly large number of people would identify the guillotine on the right as more evil than the other one because it's scary and it looks like and it's said to have killed people, right? And so on and so forth. This would give it a property of evil about it. It would incite our fear, concern, and worry because it's a tool for killing people. Is where the other one has been rendered sort of moot and harmless, and we know that it's never actually done any destruction, right? Um, museums are filled with evil artifacts, right? Because they were involved in some notorious, horrible crime. And we just have an intuitive understanding that that gives them a special dangerous property. We might say a dog is evil that seems intent upon killing people, right? It may not have any moral compunctions, right? As where a good dog is a dog that helps human beings and saves their lives and lets you know that Timmy's fallen down the well. I just feel like we're losing some of this in our understanding of things. And because we like to, and here's, let me get to my sort of final grand finale point, which is that because we justify war, because we take away its evil nature by rationalizing and saying that it's for a good cause, we are far more likely to engage in it as an activity because we don't recognize its intrinsic evil. Right. So we're a little more trigger happy, a little less likely to look for other outcomes because we think that a moral war is not only not evil, it's good. It's an awesome thing. It's great to go to war to fight the bad guys. Right. And I would rather people see it as a terrible evil that is only to be engaged in when a terrible evil is better than a more terrible evil. And I think human society would be a lot better off if we had that attitude.
All right. So I'm going to address that, and with my final point, but I want to come back to what you mentioned about the definition of evil being wrath and destruction. I think that you've maybe focused, in my opinion, here on the wrong part of that. The difference between wrath and the difference between destruction. Wrath, on one hand, means that somebody is angry, somebody powerful is angry, is going to bring about the destruction. It isn't the destruction itself that is evil. It is the individual that's bringing it about. There is an anger behind there. There's an intent. Intent, I think, is the most important thing in all these different nations. You've mentioned it several times. If you have a dog that seems intent on destroying or killing people, then that dog is going to be labeled evil. Well, that's true, but that's only because we think that the dog has an intent to do it. So we classify the dog as evil because we recognize or seem that we recognize that the dog has an intent. Now, by the same token, you admit that the dog may not have intents at all, may not want to destroy or kill anything. So we can be mistaken. And that's going to bring me back to my final point that's in response to yours, is that superstition does not help us make rational decisions. When we take two guillotines and we look at one and one seems to be more evil, that's because we have some superstitions. We have some beliefs that aren't rational, that because something looks scary, it must be evil. So when you say that those superstitions are going to help us make better decisions when deciding whether or not to go to war because something is super scary, I'm going to say that superstition, because it gives us an unreasonable and an impractical definition of reality. Because if we look at two guillotines that were handmade, one's dressed up, or even if it was the actual machine, and we look at it and that one seems more scary, so we're not going to be in the room with it. I mean, we're making irrational decisions. So to call things like war, to call things like swords, to call things like weapons, to call things like earthquakes or anything like that that doesn't act or that doesn't make decisions, to call them evil is just us labeling them with our own superstitions, and it gives us a false idea of how things really work. A guillotine is not evil. Individuals who use it could be evil. War is not evil. Individuals who, excuse me, individuals who send their soldiers to war for the wrong cause or to defend something that's evil, or to defend an evil desire or evil actions that they're taking. I mean, that those actions are evil, but the process, in my opinion, is not evil.
Well, I would start with the old quote, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, which illustrates the idea that we could have good intent and we can be morally just and yet still manage to do great evil to the world. So I think, and that's the understanding that I'm trying to inculcate here. And I wouldn't say that I'm advocating for superstition. I'm
Okay.
saying that our superstitions are instinctive reactions to something that actually is rational, which is the danger that a thing poses to us. So the bloody guillotine that has killed many people represents a time in which it was thought by human beings justified to cut off other people's heads. As where the guillotine with flowers represents a person who wants to take a tool that was meant for destruction and turn it to a purpose of good, one of decorative beauty and otherwise, sort of redemption, you might say, right?
Would you
So,
say
so
that?
it reminds us of an intent. It gives us a feeling of what is dangerous here and what is not dangerous. And so to understand evil is to understand that which is truly dangerous to us and that which is not.
Would you admit, though, that both the guillotine that splashed in blood that had killed 27 people and the one that's covered in flowers, to an individual at that moment looking at both those guillotines, are they not equally dangerous?
A purely rational perspective, they are equally dangerous. And so I would say that our fear is perhaps misdirected, but what we've done is it's not the guillotine itself that we're reacting to, but the context in which it's placed, right? And so the guillotine in the violent context is deemed evil because there's evil associated with it, right? Which is the death and dismemberment of human beings. And the other one is not because it's placed in a context of flowers and art. So we may be reacting to the guillotine, and so that might be a misdirection of our feelings, but the feelings are still valid because actually what is at play is what the guillotine had done.
I would be interested to see your experiment take place. I wonder if it has done. If you take the painted guillotine and the bloody guillotine, and just to see what individuals would say. It seems to me that in today's era, and maybe I'm completely off base, that individuals would understand that these are tools, and tools are not dangerous unless you have a tool user. And so that you could say which one is more evil. I mean, that implies, as long as you didn't say which one is more evil and they had to force to pick one, if you explained to them that it could be one or the other or neither or both, I would say would be if they're either equally evil or not, or none of them at all, I would say that would be the most common answer. But I mean, I don't have any evidence to pick that.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume you would say that most people would say the one that's bloody and that had actually killed people is more evil, that people would deem that. I just seemed, to me, that seems so irrational, but I understand. I mean, like you said, we have superstitions. They've served us well through our evolutionary history, superstitions. So, but
Sure.
I would hope that we would be able to understand that in a situation like that they are not evil. And I guess that would boil down. But would you say that in that particular instance, there can be someone who's right and wrong if two people have different answers to that question about which one is evil? Because I mean,
well, everyone's going to have their own understanding of what evil means, right? So, in the course of a debate, I'm going to argue for my definition and kind of why I think it's useful and relevant, right? Which I sort of did here, and acknowledging that it is not the way most people see it these days, right? I think maybe the way I'm arguing for it, to a degree, was very common. Let's
I mean, I
say
don't want to
2,000
use
years
the
ago or
word.
something, right? And today it's
I
very
don't want to
uncommon. It's not understood that
use
way
the
at
word
all.
antiquated, an antiquated viewpoint of evil, because I don't. I
It
mean, I
probably
don't want to
is.
use that as a negative word, but that's when you described it to me. That's what I think, that seems a very,
Oh yeah,
medieval understanding of evil, as opposed to I don't enlightened in the sense of,
yeah.
the rational enlightenment.
Right. Yeah. No, and I agree with you 100%. I guess I'm just sort of trying to argue in a sense that there's maybe a little bit more to the antiquated understanding than we let on, because it was so based in superstition, and we've fought against that, right? It's one of those pendulum things. Like the pendulum was way over here in the land of
Right.
superstition, like it has evil spirits that's going to murder me in the night. You still see that, some
Right.
people still have those views. And then it swung way back over here, where the evil is only a moral judgment that people make, and maybe it's subjective, and maybe it's entirely what's the other one? Moral objectivism. Anyway, maybe it's just sort of completely arbitrary, right? So there's this pendulum going back and forth, and I'm saying that even though, like, I'm probably more over here, there's actually something to this area over here, a little more than people might realize, a truth that maybe we've lost a little bit of over the years, and that maybe can serve us again to some benefit by having less war. Because we understand that it is intrinsically a terrifying and horrifying activity. They say war is hell, right? That's kind of the way we express that now. I say war is evil, just to perhaps slightly get more attention, to sound a little crazy, so that I can then explain
Sure.
this whole sort of rationale and make my case as to why we should have.
I mean,
but yeah, I think there's a value there. I think to answer your question, I think if you showed it to like call out debaters, they would say none or both more commonly than anything else. I think if you showed
Sure.
it to other groups of people in different circumstances, you'd probably get different kinds of answers. Probably pretty easy to manipulate those answers in one way or another. But I thought the guillotine was a good example to talk about.
Just in a final, I guess, a little final statement. Thank you for the debate. It seems to me that you can't fight evil with more evil. So if you're going to fight evil, what you're doing has to be good, because it's in opposition to evil. So if you believe that evil exists, then when you're trying to end that evil or complement, so you're going to have to bring it back at least to neutral, if not all the way to good. So you have to fight evil with good. I don't think that it's possible to have two evils, to fight evil with evil and come out with a good. But I do believe that there are instances when wars have been fought that the end result has been good. So to me, it seems like if they're an evil that exists, someone comes in and fights that evil, what they're doing has to have been a good, because it's brought about a greater good. If it had been more evil, it's not like evil versus evil cancels itself out and just ends up with nothing. I mean, because all that would be left would be, it doesn't seem to me like you could take evil, throw in some more evil, let it cancel each other out, and be left with good. So you would have to, if you bring in just bring in a bunch of good, which would be the fighting against the evil, it cancels out the evil and you're left over with good, would be just a generalized way to explain it. And it doesn't seem to me that you would be able to get to a good by adding evil to evil.
I think the way I would explain it is use evil to counteract other evil, that it is necessary sometimes to take on war or poison or destruction in order to destroy poison or dominate something else that is bad. And usually the solution is a short-term evil in order to defeat a long-term evil. That's usually how it works out. And I think it is justified, and I think it is the way it actually works. I actually think people who come home, like PTSD, is sometimes because we pretend that, oh no, it was a glorious, wonderful war, you should be very proud of everything you did, denies the reality that they feel. Sure. Because they really experienced hell.
I don't disagree with you there. I mean, it's definitely more. I would be interested to know if cancer survivors would call their chemotherapy evil, or if they would call it good. And that would be interesting. That would be
It's a
that
great
would be
question.
interesting. Just yeah.
Yeah, I'll
Oh,
look
I
it up.
wonder. Thank you again.
It was a great debate, Mike. I really enjoyed this one more than most others I've had.